Back in 2015, there was a letter that was published that shook many people's testimony of the restored gospel. That letter was authored by a man named Jeremy Runnells and was addressed to an employee of the church educational system. It became known as the C.E.S. letter. In the letter, Mr. Runnels attacks foundational truth claims of the restored gospel and Joseph Smith. On this episode, I have on Sarah Allen. Sarah is a lifelong devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a volunteer for Fair Mormon, which is a group dedicated to providing well-informed and well-documented answers to gospel questions. In our conversation, Sarah provides well-documented, accurate historical data to refute some of the letter's most well-known accusations. Stick around to get equipped to defend the restored gospel of Jesus Christ on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. There is no doubt, as a general rule, Mormons are a real social people, and there's no better place to connect with other people than at conferences devoted to Mormonism. With that said, there's one coming up that I can't recommend highly enough, and that is the Restoration Torah Conference. It is happening this year on May 26th and 27th in Linden, Utah. Many speakers you'll hear there have been on this podcast. They include Jacob Vadreen, Hannah Stoddard, Taylor Smith, Joshua Erickson, Kimberly Smith, myself, and more. Go to restorationtorahconference.org or click on the link in this episode page notes to find out how you can attend. Here's the unfortunate truth right now. As fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks, we can't expect to have accurate history told by others because true history and scholarship is problematic for certain people and organizations. We're going to have to do this work ourselves, and to do that, we'll have to support each other in this kind of work. Now, anybody who's anybody in fundamentalist circles knows who Drew Briney is. He is perhaps the most prolific author within Mormon fundamentalism. Drew's newest project is something I think all Mormons can benefit from. He is in the process of creating an annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants. Once you have a copy of this, you'll be able to compare current sections with previous versions and also what early LDS leaders had to say about that particular section. As fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks, we are constantly trying to get back into the minds of the early brethren. This project that Drew is engaged in right now is going to be the ultimate tool to help us do that. Now, because this annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants is such a massive undertaking, Drew needs some help from others. Drew's plan for getting this annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants out is through crowdfunding. The link for that will be out April 4th. If you want more details sooner, go to Drew's Facebook page and message him from there, and he'll give you all the details. Further, on Saturday, April 8th, I'll be releasing an episode that talks about this project in greater detail. So please, if you feel impressed to do so and have the means, I'd humbly ask that you reach out to Drew and support this project that will help advance the scholarship and true doctrine of the restored gospel. Look, we live in some pretty challenging times. Instability is all around us and it can feel pretty overwhelming. In order to not just survive, but to thrive in this time, we all need to strengthen our relationship with God, then maximize and engage every promise and gift God has given us. In his new book, Energy Unveiled, Derek Peterson lays out some important principles which will give you the tools and practices to strengthen your relationship with God and help you maximize your own potential to get through these trying times. Head over to MormonRenegade.com. Click on the link in this episode page and get your copy today. Because of your generosity last year, I was able to buy better audio equipment and software. I can't tell you how much it meant to me that not only did you spend your time here with me on the podcast, but also that you found enough value in what I'm doing that you donated the podcast to upgrade it. This year, I want to continue to grow. Now, I want to add video to the podcast to continue to help you, my guests, and myself connect better through the show. The other feature I'm working on for this podcast is something I have to remain vague about for now. But what I can say is that it's something that will help us better connect as fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks. Now, to get that equipment for the video content I want to do and to build the infrastructure for the other project with this podcast, donations would certainly be welcome. Or you can go to MormonRenegade.com, click that supply store button, and get some new swag. New stuff will be out soon as well. Now, if you can't afford to do either of those two things, I totally get it. Maybe just keep the podcast in your prayers that we'll be blessed with those resources. Again, thank you for everything you do as well as for listening to the podcast.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Sarah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, real quick, I always like to just get a little background so people know who it is I'm talking to, right? I never want to just be like, here's this expert, take her word for it, or my word. I always say you need to go do your own research. But part of that is getting to know people. Were you raised LDS, Sarah?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Were you raised like here around Utah, or were you all over the place, or?
I was born in Washington State, but we moved here when I was pretty young. So I lived here most of my life. As an adult, I lived for a little while in Ireland, but that was only for a few months.
Wow, I'll bet you that was an experience.
Awesome, yeah.
So what part of Washington were you born in?
I was born in Bellevue, which is a suburb of Seattle.
I know exactly where it's at. So I have like a lot of connections up there. My wife was born in Longview. My mom lived in Kennewick up by, Tri-Cities area. And then I spent summers with my grandparents up in Port Orchard. So I'm pretty familiar with that neck of the woods.
Yeah, it's beautiful up there.
Too much rain for me. I enjoy being able to see for a ways, and felt a little penned in at times. But so what took
I
you
don't
to what's that?
I was gonna say I don't mind the rain, obviously, going to Ireland. It rained every day I was there almost.
What took you to Ireland?
There is something called a BUNAC visa that you can get if you are a single adult under the age of 30 and you take 8 college credit hours that semester. You can just apply for a work visa to go off for 4 to 6 months in a different country and work. And so I did that.
Nice. What'd you do while you were up there for work?
I worked at a bank.
Okay.
Yeah. I did mortgage, kind of like junior underwriting for mortgages.
Nice. I'll bet you that was fun being up there.
It was a blast. Loved every minute of it.
What's the restored gospel like up that way?
Um, the people there are fantastic. They're incredibly friendly. They just opened up a brand new ward there in Dublin when I was there. That was very close to my house. Before that, there was only one. And so they split it into two, down one on each half of the city. The city is kind of dissected right through the middle by a river.
Okay.
And the one that they had before was on the north side, and I lived on the south side. So it was nice to have one right by my house. They actually, the website wouldn't do the ward locator thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't working. And so I had to call them and ask them. And the name of my street is very similar to a suburb of Dublin. So they sent me like 4 hours away the first couple of weeks until I figured out there was actually one about 10 minutes from my house.
Yeah, no, it's funny when you just go back east to the United States, right? Out in the West, we're kind of spoiled because everything just runs north, south, east, west for the most part, right? But you get on the East Coast, you get in Europe, nothing is straight. It all winds somewhere and will throw you into a circle. And then you're like, where am I? And it takes a minute to wrap your head around that.
That is very true. Dublin is not too hard to get around once you're familiar with it because it's a small city, but it does take a little while to learn your way around a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's once you get used to it, it's not too bad, but it does take a minute to get your mind wrapped around a lot of that. But so for my listeners here, I reached out to Sarah because for a while I've been wanting to have someone on who's kind of been able to kind of take to task the C.E.S. letter. Now, for those of you who don't know what the C.E.S. letter, I'm going to have Sarah explain exactly what it is, what its history is, and that sort of stuff. And then we'll move into kind of some of her rebuttals for it, because this letter has done untold damage to so many Mormons of every stripe. Sarah's an active LDS woman, but in this instance, it's one of those places where I feel like we should really be standing together, both fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks, because I feel like, again, this is something where we're like, we should have each other's backs on this, because this is a Mormon problem. This isn't just an LDS church problem or a fundamentalist problem. So, Sarah, real quick, what was the CES letter?
Well, first of all, I do completely agree with you. I think we need to build bridges on this, and that's why I'm happy to be here. So the C.E.S. letter was a document that was written by a man named Jeremy Runnells. He posted it on Reddit back in late March of 2013. He provided a download link and asked everybody to pass it around and share it and to tweak it so it fit their circumstances a little bit better, kind of personalize it. And he wrote it to a C.E.S. director that his grandfather knew that he had asked him to talk to after Jeremy was leaving the church. He was still technically a member, but he didn't believe in the gospel at all. He was at that point a proclaimed atheist. He was writing angry letters to some of the apostles that you can find online. He was very angry and bitter at that point. And so he did say in a comment that he has since deleted on Reddit that he did not write the letter specifically for the C.E.S. director. He addressed it to him, but he didn't write it to him because nothing that the guy said would have changed his mind at all or made any difference. He was already mentally out of the church at that point. But he wanted to pacify his grandfather and keep the family peace. So he wrote the letter out, and the guy never responded to him after that. Like, he had agreed to read through it and everything, and then he never responded. And so that was kind of the big story of it. Oh, the church can't answer these questions. So it got passed around like crazy, and they posted it up on Mormon stories. And I think Mormon Think was the first one, just within weeks of his posting it on the ex-Mormon subreddit. And then it just took off like crazy from there.
Right. Real quick, what does Mormon Think?
Mormon Think is an anti-Mormon website where they did the same thing that Jeremy did, where they initially pretended to be members of the church who were active in their wards, and then it came out later that no, they weren't. So they all eventually left the church, but for a while they were doing it's what is called on Reddit as PIMO, physically and mentally out. And so they are still active for various reasons, but they don't believe in the church anymore. They don't believe in the gospel at all. And so Mormon Think was run by a bunch of those people, and it is very similar to the C.E.S. letter, where it lists a bunch of questions and then goes through and lists a bunch of things that they claim are true, but are kind of twisted and aren't actually true. Okay. So it's very.
So real quick, do we know why that C.E.S. director, not that it would have mattered, right? Because Jeremy said, hey, it wouldn't have changed my mind one way or another, which I think can speak to the idea of being an honest seeker, right? At least get out there and say, there's nothing that's going to change my mind here. I'm out. So I find it a little bit disingenuous that he wrote that letter to him anyway. But do we have any idea why the C.E.S. director didn't respond back?
Nothing that I know for sure. I would assume it's because the first version of the letter was very hostile. It's still hostile now, but the original one was even worse. And it was very angry in tone. And once you've been doing this for a little while, you kind of start to realize when people are genuinely looking for answers and when they're just venting. And it was very clear that Jeremy was just venting. So I think he was like, well, it's probably not going to do any good at this point, because I think he was just expecting like a couple of questions, and he wasn't expecting like a 100-page document of one accusation after another. So my opinion is that he probably looked at it and went, he's beyond that at this point. He's too angry to listen.
Right. I did watch the Mormon Stories episode with Jeremy, and I want to be careful here that these aren't ad hominem attacks, right? That's not what I'm out for. I'm out for actually dissecting the letter. But I did find Jeremy to be somewhat approachable, right? I want to give him a proper due there. I, you get the sense that he had a, or at least this was my takeaway. He's hearing impaired, and he had a blessing that said his hearing would be restored, and it didn't. And to me, just as an outsider looking in, it seemed like there was maybe a little bit of heartbreak there mixed
Okay.
in with that. And so I kind of felt for him that way. However, that doesn't take away from some of the things that was in that letter. And again, that letter's done just untold damage to Mormons of all stripes. So what kind of accusations was he leveling in that letter, Sarah?
Um, that God was schizophrenic and psychotic, and that you couldn't trust the spirit, and that Joseph Smith was a fraud, and that the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham weren't historical. He went through every single pillar that somebody who believes in the restored gospel, or any of, like, even at all remotely connected to it through history or through belief, any of that. Um, he just knocked down every single pillar of a testimony that he could think of.
Right. Um, Specifically in the Book of Mormon, he raised things like anachronisms. He raised things like, there were no horses in the Book of Mormon, which now I have to be like, because we found we found some of those. So we know those are there. But when he's knocking those pillars down, is it okay if I mention, because I can edit this later, is it okay if I mention that you work for Fair or work
Yeah,
with Fair? Okay. All right.
I don't get paid, but yes.
Okay. So were you a member of Fair during those days when that letter first came out?
No, I did not come to Fair until after I started writing those posts.
Okay.
Started writing my rebuttal to it on Reddit, and one of my co-moderators is on the Fair board, and he took them to the president of Fair behind my back and did not tell me that he was doing that until after he had done it. And the Fair board liked them and wanted to post them on their website, and so that is how I came to be affiliated with Fair.
Okay. Perfect. Um, what was your first impression as you first read through the letter?
I read through it the first time several years ago. Not when it first came out, but probably around 2015 or so. And my first impression when I read through it was, oh, here we go again. Just because there wasn't much in it that was new. A lot of it was things that you had just seen come up over and over and over again in anti-LDS literature before. And they were things that, because I like to read and I like history, and so I have read a lot of LDS history. So a lot of them were things that I was comfortable responding to, and like, oh, well, that's not exactly true. That's wrong, when I was going through it. And so none of it really bothered me, but the tone of it bothered me because it was so angry. And that is what initially a lot of people responded to.
Right. I think in some ways, and maybe this is an unfair characterization, but I feel like Jeremy writes that thing from a place of sincerity, right? Because it comes across that he's really struggling. He's angry. I get all those feelings, right? I get them 100%. But I almost feel like the anti-Mormon crowd got around him and said, "Here's our champion, right? Here's the guy we're going to put forward." And at least on my end, maybe you've heard something different because you're in different circles than I am. I haven't heard too much out of him since then. There's been a few revisions to the letter, if I'm not mistaken, but to me, he seemed kind of quiet now. What is that the case?
Not really, no.
Okay.
He's still a frequent presence. He still comments on the ex-Mormon subreddit. He still writes rebuttals to everyone. He wrote several to me that I have not read, but I read some of his previous ones, like to Jim Bennett and Dan Peterson and things. So I knew what sort of things would be in it, and I didn't want to read them because I knew I would stew over it and take it personally. And I knew it would just turn into like a big argument back and forth, and I didn't want to do that. So I haven't read them. I've heard what is in them. He is, from what I understand, writing a massive rebuttal to everybody that's going to just include every single possible thing that anybody has ever said in defense of the restored church.
Wow.
But apparently that's in the works from what I hear.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
At what point do you decide that, you know what, someone has to say something about this letter? Because I'll admit, when I first saw it, I first see it, and at this point, I'm still an active member of the LDS Church, and I'm just like, whatever, right? I got other things to worry about. You could tell he was angry, and I was like, maybe it's just a vent or whatever. At what point do you feel like, okay, somebody's gotta give a rebuttal to this?
It wouldn't die, basically. It just kept going. Like I said, I'm a moderator at the LDS subreddit on Reddit, and I am also fairly active in the Latter-day Saints subreddit as well. So we would get questions about it. There are trolling comments coming through all the time saying, read the C.E.S letter. That artist who worked for Marvel put it in one of the Spider-Man comics. He was wearing a C.E.S letter patch in one of the comics. They had tracked it and edit that out. So like it just wouldn't die. It just kept coming up over and over again. We kept getting questions from it. People quote it to us like, we don't know what's in it, they think they're being clever and saying, well, what about this? And they phrase it in word for word the way that he phrases it, like we wouldn't notice that
Right.
they're from it. Just things like that. And so it just kept coming up. And there were a bunch of other rebuttals to it, and they all were really good at certain things, but none of them were really comprehensive, that were really good at everything. And so I thought that somebody should probably do that, was my first thought about it. And then Heavenly Father went, well, why don't you? And I went, I'm not qualified to do that. What do you no, I can't do that. But that prompting would not leave. The first thing that made me think of doing that was Scott Gordon, who is the president of Fair, gave a presentation a couple years ago at one of the Fair conferences where he went through the first chapter. It was so long he didn't have time to do anything else, but he went through the Book of Mormon section and he showed all of the things that were wrong with it. And I went, somebody needs to do that for the whole thing, because like he went really comprehensive. He had graphics and showing all of it and everything. And I was like, somebody really needs to go through that just point by point and put the same level of detail into it that Scott did. So that's kind of where it started, and the prompting wouldn't leave. So after a couple of months, I finally reached out on Reddit and was like, would anybody be interested in this? And people said yes. So I started writing them, and they got way more attention than I was anticipating. I was expecting, maybe 5 to 10 people would read through them and it would die out after a couple of weeks, and that would be that. And then that's not what happened. And it kind of snowballed. And then one of my co-moderators, who was very well-meaning, went and started advertising it around Reddit to other places that I was not advertising it to.
Uh-oh.
And yeah, so we got a ton of trolls on the first couple of posts, and I was like, okay. So then they were aware that it was happening, and so then they kept an eye on it, and they kept trying to comment on it and to badger me on it, and we were flooded with trolls for a couple of weeks, and then they got bored and lost interest. But other people weren't bored and weren't losing interest, and they wanted to read them, so I kept writing them, and then it just went forever.
There's so much of that part that I can relate to. This whole podcast was born out of me going, someone should really do this. And then, I could tell you where I was. I was away for work, and I never sleep good when I'm away from my family, especially for work, because I'm in a strange place and I know my family's a ways away. But I was in West Texas and just thought about my journey, how I got here to fundamentalism. I thought, I wish I would have had someone that would have showed me how to do this. Someone should really do that. And then it snowballs. And then the part where you say, maybe 5 to 10 people. I think I had the same number when I started this podcast. I often joked, I figured it would be me and 8 other listeners, and that would be it. And it took on a life of its own. And then you're like, you start seeing your stuff posted by other people on Facebook, and you're like, oh crap, right? Like that was not supposed to happen. So I can totally identify with that. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
the trolls as well, right? That's the other thing. The trolls come out in force, right? So you better have some thick skin if you're gonna drop your hat in the public arena, because people are ruthless.
Yes, they are.
So, but so when were you guys seeing people come out of the woodwork saying, last week I was a strong member of the LDS Church, or I was a strong Mormon, and then all of a sudden they're on the other side of that spectrum now, where they're like, I just read this and now I'm doubting everything? Was it that dramatic of a shift? Were you seeing that sort of thing?
Yes. Yeah. And I have had people message me, like private message me in the middle of the night saying, I was just reading my scriptures and I came across this verse and now I'm spiraling and I don't know what to do. And like it was that kind of thing, but more so with the C.E.S letter. Like people would be like, I was just, my friend had some questions. I was trying to answer them and I came across, they showed me what they were reading and what do I do now? I have no idea what to do. And just complete panic. They don't know what, they don't know how to answer any of it. They don't know what to say or do. They don't even know where to begin to start researching it. So that's why we felt, maybe it'd be a good idea to point people to where they can go to find those answers that they need.
Yeah, I can identify with that too. I started this podcast last April, and literally within weeks, Under the Banner of Heaven came out. And then a couple months after that, the Netflix special on Warren Jeffs came out, right? So I was like backpedaling a little bit, right? Trying to play defense a little bit, because I mean, especially those two films, I mean, they had a lot to do with fundamentalism, right? And so all of a sudden, and not only that, the one thing I wasn't prepared for was the crossover, right? So I would have active LDS people reach out to me, be like, what's this blood atonement thing, right? Or what's this Adam God thing? And they're freaked out. And I think one of the major misconceptions I deal with here on the podcast is, oh, you must have an awful axe to grind with the LDS Church. And I'm like, not really. No, I enjoyed my time there. I really did. I don't have an axe to grind. So I wasn't prepared for that. Just the people who were like, we're about to stop going to church and all that other stuff. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, let's break this down a little bit. And so we, it's a weird way how the Lord works, because one minute you're pretty comfortable and the next minute you're right in the fire. But so there's a lot there I can identify with, Sarah. So you decide you're going to sit down, you're going to write this rebuttal.
Yeah.
Did you have this idea that would be one big rebuttal, or did you think you were going to take it in sections? And what'd you ultimately end up settling on?
No, very, very early on, I was thinking it would be cool to have, I would post my thoughts and then have other people post their resources and their thoughts and just kind of create a big library of stuff that we could point people to. And that's not really what happened. And then I was not planning on doing like a line by line thing. And if you go look at some of the earlier posts, they're not line by line. I'm just, referencing, at this point he said this, and, here he was talking about this, and I don't really go through and post it word for word or anything, because I wasn't planning on doing that. I was just going to do an overview of each section, and I wasn't thinking it would take very long. And then that it kind of turned into people were asking more specific questions about specific things that he said that I kind of skimmed over. And so I was like, okay, guess we better, start going through it a little bit more. And, at first I was intending to just focus on like the big issues, like the major lies and distortions that I could see in it. But then as I was going through some of it, it was like every single sentence was wrong and needed a response of some kind. And it just kind of went from there. And so
Gotcha.
It's just supposed to be a series of like 10 to 12 posts just going over like the major highlights and stuff. And then it ended up being like 70 posts long, and it took over a year, and it was insane. So
Wow. Wow. So you talk in there, you just said real quick, excuse me, that the more you read, the more lies and distortions you found. What were some of the biggest ones that you found in there?
I found things like he was plagiarizing entire passages out of Grant Palmer's book without citing them. Grant Palmer is an ex-member of the LDS Church who used to work in the church educational system and then retired, wrote an anti-Mormon book, and left. And so that was it's an insider's view of Mormon origins or something like that.
Right. Yep.
It's fairly popular in ex-Mormon circles. And there are several plagiarized passages of that I was seeing. There were things like he was like, isn't it so convenient that the Book of Mormon was first published in Sharon, Vermont, when Oliver Cowdery lived right next door over in this whatever county's right next door to Rutledge County. And you're like, well, the Book of Mormon, it wasn't first published in Sharon, Vermont, it was published in Palmyra. Everybody knows that, So there are little things like that. And then there were other things where I noticed he would say something and not back it up. And then he would just keep repeating it over and over again like it was a fact when he hadn't said anything to support it. And it was something that I knew was not true. Like I had plenty of sources I could point to that said the exact opposite of what he was saying. So there were little things like that. And then there were other things where it was just the wording where he was using like the most inflammatory language he could think of. And so I was pointing out some of those tactics, like the phrasing that he was using, and like some of the fallacies that he was coming from and things like that. And people responded to that as well. They wanted to know more of what was being distorted and how it was being distorted and what to spot for when they were reading that kind of material.
Gotcha. So how about specific issues? What kind of specific issues can you look back on and go, okay, that's just patently false, whether he intended to lie or whether he was just mistaken, whatever it is. I always like to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but what were some of the biggest just out and out wrong ideas that were contained within in his letter?
There was a big one on the Book of Abraham where he just kept saying over and over again that the Book of Abraham was based on the Papyrus 1, which is what it's now called. The fragments that were near facsimile 1 on the fragments that we have. No LDS scholar actually believes that. That is something that non-LDS scholars really push, but it's not something that any LDS scholar, particularly the Egyptologists, believe at all, because there was a lot more papyri than what still exists today. We know that from the records. There were records that were lost in the Great Chicago Fire.
Right.
So no, where the Book of Abraham came from. We can't say, oh, they took it from those characters right there, because there's nothing that says that they came from those characters right there. Joseph Smith, we have record of him saying in a speech in Nauvoo right before his death that he translated the rolls of papyri that were in his house at the time.
Yeah.
So that was a big one. The anachronisms was another big one.
Before we move on to the anachronisms, I want to go ahead and talk about the Book of Abraham, because that seems to be a big focal point now on which all the experts are coming hard for. And you're exactly right. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, you'd probably know better than I think someone said that some of those scrolls were in the excess of 10 feet long, right? I mean, these were big scrolls, and they are correct in the terms that some of the characters that are referenced within the facsimiles are from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But we would expect to find that, because if we know anything about Egyptian culture, it's that you wanted that Book of the Dead as you passed when you were Egyptian, because that was your guidebook. The idea was you take that with you. That would be your guidebook to get through to the other side. And it wasn't nearly as long as what all these other accounts are that Joseph Smith had. And then you have the fire. So it's really convenient to point to these one facsimiles that were, in my estimation, put into our scriptures as at least being like, look, this is what we found, right? I mean, doing honest historical work. While I'm not a trained historian, I did do a little bit of work when I lived on the Eastern Shore, where I'm a land surveyor by profession. So we would go and do some mapping on the digs they were doing. And I remember this professor told me once, no one can ever call you a liar for showing what you found. Right. And so in this effort to be transparent, at least in my estimation, those get put into the scriptures. And then all of a sudden, because people make assumptions, we conclude, oh, this must have been the whole document. And that's just not the case. As you said, a lot of it was burnt up in that Chicago fire.
Yes. Yeah. John Gee put out a formula. He used like the standard formula that a lot of Egyptologists will use to determine scroll length. And he estimated that the missing portion would have been somewhere between like 12 to 20 additional feet, something like that. I could be way off. I haven't read that article in a while. But there's also a story that got passed around like fourth hand, I think, by the time it finally came out to be public. But it was Joseph F. Smith as a child. He remembered seeing the roll unraveled in his family home. His father was Hiram Smith, or his grandfather was Hiram Smith, and he remembered like having it unraveled in his house, and it went from one end of the room clear to the other end of the house. Like it was,
holy cow.
And we don't have anything like that. We only have a couple of loose pages and scraps, and we know there's stuff that we don't have because we don't have the originals of facsimiles 2 or 3.
Right.
And we also have characters that Oliver Cowdery wrote down in a book that we don't have any trace of that scroll left. It's completely gone. So we know there's stuff that is missing that we don't have.
Wow. Okay, let's move on to the anachronisms. Real quick, for anyone who doesn't know, explain what an anachronism is, please.
Okay, sure. So the Book of Mormon mentions things like barley and iron and horses and things where for a while it looked like those did not exist in the Americas during that time. So they're historically inaccurate. But more evidence has come out over time that shows that most of those things actually were in the Americas, particularly in the Mesoamerican region during the time period that the Nephites would have lived.
So a lot of the stuff that he claimed as anachronisms have now been found.
Yep. Including her stones.
Yep. That was a big one. I remember when that came out. I want to say it was just 2 or 3 months ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. They just put out 2 different papers in a couple of scientific journals talking all about it.
So when you had to go try to debunk those anachronisms, did you were they hard to find? Were they fairly easy to find? That sort of thing.
Some of them were pretty easy. Like for wheat was one of them that was mentioned as being inaccurate. But if you look at in the Mesoamerican area in particular, there's a grain called amaranth that looks like red wheat that the Aztecs would grind down and use as wheat, the way that we use wheat. And it was one of their staple grains, and it had been in there for generations, and it looks just like red wheat. And there were other things like swine, and you have little javelinas and peccaries and whatever you want to call them. They look like little furry pigs. And there were things like barley. For a long time, barley was thought not to exist in the Americas before Columbus came. But they have found 10 plus sites of what they call small barley or little barley that was native to the Americas prior to European colonization. So because I had read some of that stuff before, I knew where some of it was, but I did have to go digging for others. And, I just Googled a bunch of stuff and I came up with a bunch of things. You really just need to know where to look. I read a couple of papers on FAIR and some of the old FARMS research. FARMS was another group that eventually became the Maxwell Institute, for those who don't know.
Right. So if I remember correctly from the letter, he takes after Joseph Smith pretty hard, right?
Oh, yeah.
He goes after him really hard on issues
Mhm.
like plural marriage, things like, the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. He just really tears into him. What were some of his major criticisms, and then how did you defend those? What was your ideas?
So plural marriage was obviously a big one. And so I went through a lot of the history, and one of the main things I pointed out was that, there is no evidence of any kind of sexual relations for the wives that were civilly married to other men, or for the younger teenagers. In fact, we have evidence from several of them saying that there were no sexual relations at all in those. Another one that he talked about a lot. Oh, again, also back in those days, sealings and marriages were two completely different things. Today normally, but historically they weren't. They were two completely separate things. So when Joseph would refer to them as his wives, most of the time they were sealings, and they were sealings for the next life. Some of them were obviously marriages for time and for eternity, but most of them were sealings for the next life only, as far as we can tell by any of the records that have been left behind. So that is something to point out, because, he gets called a pedophile, he gets called a pervert, like he gets called all kinds of things. And, the evidence just doesn't support any of that.
No, I just wanted to explore this a little more. I had a buddy who, and this was just a couple months ago, who's an active member of the LDS Church, and he was really struggling with this idea that Joseph Smith was a pedophile, that he was stealing other men's wives, that sort of thing. Right now, I'm a convert to Mormonism, period. Right, like there's nobody else on either side of my family; it's just me. So I have to rely a lot on my own personal studies, right? My own diving into history. And you're right. We know Joseph Smith was capable of having children, right? His marriage to Emma points that out. I find it interesting that we really can't at all find any evidence that he had children with another man's wife, right? We would expect to see that. The other thing that he was really freaked out about was his marriage to this 14-year-old girl, right? Yep. And I was like, okay, let's just assume the worst. Let's say there was marital activity that happened there. For that time period, while yes, on the younger side, it wasn't uncommon. It was up to 10%, right? So this idea that we're going to judge him based on our 21st century values, that doesn't hold water in history, period, because we're dealing with a different time, a different people, and that has to be accounted for. And it's one of those things that's just infuriating to me that it's not. The other thing I would say is that if there was relations there, again, with the married women and Helen Mar Kimball, we should expect to see children, and we just don't.
And Helen Kimball, in her autobiography, she actually said that it was for eternity alone. So she said, I mean, you could probably read that a different way if you were really strained into, but she said that it was a sealing for the next life. But you're absolutely right about the marriage ages, particularly on the frontier, and Kirtland and Nauvoo and Salt Lake were absolutely on the American frontier during different times in our country's history, particularly when the saints were living there. So you are absolutely right that younger marriages on the frontiers were common. They weren't as common on the East Coast in the big cities, but on the frontier, they were very common.
Yeah.
And,
perfect.
well, I was just going to say, all of his wives were of legal marriageable age during that time period.
Right. Right. Yeah, I find it, to be honest with you, it's one of two things. Either you're intellectually dishonest when you make that claim of Joseph Smith being a pedophile, or you're woefully ignorant of cultural um, norms of that time, given the time and place. That's one where I took exception to a little more, because I didn't feel it was a fair critique. And what I mean by fair is that no research went into that whatsoever. That was just pure garbage being spewed.
Yeah, yeah. I get that studying history isn't everybody's favorite thing. So I completely understand, not being up to date on historical research and not really understanding what life was like in the mid 1800s. Totally get that. I personally love history. I'm pretty nerdy. I absolutely love history. So for me, that was stuff I already kind of knew, and I just had to build on that a little bit. But I completely understand not knowing that. The thing is, though, that is a logical fallacy called presentism, where you judge societies and cultures and people of the past by today's standards, and today's standards are completely different. If we had lived back then, our standards would be completely different too.
Right. Right. Yeah. And when I phrased that to my buddy, I was like, look, let's just say Emma died. Let's say Joseph never introduced polygamy, plural marriage, and then he married a 14-year-old girl. How would you feel? Well, that's a little different. Exactly. Right. Let's put this all into context. Let's play a few mind games, so to speak, and say, well, what if this? What if that? And then find out really where your bias lies, because I think that speaks volumes. So
I completely agree with you on that.
So, what else did he level as criticisms against Joseph Smith? What were some of his other big ones?
The different accounts of the first vision was the big one. He was very upset about that. The biggest thing, though, was the Book of Mormon translation, using his personal seer stone for translation. Jeremy had a big problem with that, and it came up over and over and over and over and over and over and over again throughout the whole letter. He just kept referring back to the rock in the hat, as he calls it, and how why were the Nephite interpreters even there if he wasn't going to use them, that kind of thing. So those were big.
What was your rebuttal to that one? The rock in the hat and that sort of thing.
Well, I first came across that when I was about 12 years old. I was reading my parents' copy of the Ensign, and President Nelson, who is the leader of the LDS Church right now, was an apostle at the time, and he gave a speech to some mission presidents, about 100 of them, and asked them to spread the information out to their missionaries. And in that speech, which was reprinted in the Ensign a few months later, he went through and he talked about how Joseph Smith used his personal seer stone and how it was in possession of the church. They had it in the archives right then, and that Joseph used it and put it in his hat and looked in his hat to block out the light. And I went, I never heard that before. Right. So that was, and at first I was really surprised and confused. And then I immediately, it was like within 5 minutes, the Spirit just said, does it matter? And I thought about it and I went, no, guess not. Because, either way, he's using a seer stone. Either way, he's translating by revelation. Doesn't really matter what stone he used. If he used one in a hat versus two in the spectacles, they work the same way. So does it matter? No, it didn't matter to me.
Right.
It does to other people. So I get that.
So I have a buddy who's not Mormon at all. And I remember we were talking about this, and he's like, I just got to say, I think it's one of the most metal stories out of all of Mormonism. I think it's cool. Right. And I was like, okay, all right, good on you. But so does he ever attack modern day leaders of the LDS Church? Does he attack that movement?
Yep, yeah, he has a whole section on prophets, and he goes in that one. He avoids Joseph Smith so much, but he goes from Brigham Young onwards, and he goes after all of them, including the our president and apostles today. He went after a bunch of them from the 90s, 80s. President Hinckley, he went after President Oaks, went after President Packer, Boyd K. Packer, and Neil Maxwell. He went after a whole bunch of them. So in that, it was mostly, pointing out that some of them have made mistakes in the past. Like he was talking about Adam, God, and blood atonement and things like that. And he brought up the priesthood restriction. And just, today so for that one, the priesthood restriction is obviously a complicated, difficult topic to discuss. So I don't know how deep you want to go into that, but Jeremy went after it pretty hard. And you just have to point out, first of all, the Journal of Discourses, where all of those sermons are from that he was quoting, those have been edited over the years. The transcriptionists, the reporters, they copied them down word for word, and then they edited them completely and added their own thoughts and changed all the wording, took out huge portions of it and everything when they were preparing them for publication. And so the original ones that we have are completely different from the sermons that were given. And we can prove that because we have a small group of them that have been since the original transcripts have since been transcribed from shorthand into readable English, and they are completely different. So we didn't know that for the longest time, but now we do. And you can't really base things off of what may not have actually been said. So that is something to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind is, prophets are human too. And we all make mistakes. I make tons of mistakes. I'm not going to hold them up as being perfect and expect them to not make mistakes that I would make.
Right.
But that is a common criticism, that they do expect prophets to be pretty infallible, and I don't know why.
Yeah, to me that one boggles my mind, that you would ascribe a level of godliness to a mortal, right? And that's essentially what you're doing when you say they should be infallible. You are basically saying, look, here's the thing, they're men. At the end of the day, they're dudes, right? And they're dudes with a calling, right? Because in my church, we have a prophet and a leader. I think he's a great guy, but I don't, I would never try to have my expectations be to perfection, right? That's not fair to my testimony, and that's certainly not fair to my leader, right? That's not fair to him. He doesn't deserve that. He's doing the best he can in his calling, just like I'm doing the best I can in mine. And I'm often surprised at the lack of grace that's extended to people. The other thing I'll say is, if you're looking for perfection in a prophet, good luck, because it's not there. It's not there in the Old Testament. It's not there in the New Testament, right? You have Moses that kills a dude. You got Jonah that runs from God. You've got, you've got Peter who denies Christ. And all of them the Lord continues to use, right? But for whatever reason, and again, I think some of it's presentism, right? We tend to be way harder on Latter-day leaders, whether that's Joseph Smith and members of the LDS Church, or leaders of the LDS Church, or Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and fundamentalist leaders. We tend to be way harder on them, and I think it's because they're this close, so to speak, in history, right? They're right here. And we tend to look past the errors of older prophets in the scriptures, and I find that an interesting dichotomy.
So do I, and that is something that comes up in the scriptures too. Like there are a couple of verses throughout says scriptures that talk about how people look at past prophets and they ignore the present ones. And several of our leaders have said that. I think it was President Kimball who said, they praise the prophets of the past while they mentally stone the living ones. And that happens over and over and over again throughout the scriptures and throughout our history. And I agree. I think it is a lack of grace and charity. And I think that it is very strange to hold them to a different standard than you would hold yourself to.
Right. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So you kind of collect all this data, right? And you're like, okay, I'm ready to go. You sit down at your keyboard and you type it up. What are you thinking before you publish that first one? Because that's always a different thing, right? Because by now the CES letter has caught fire. It is moving like a wildfire in a grassland. It seems like there's no way to contain it. What's your first thoughts as you're getting ready to hit the post button, so to speak?
I prayed real hard first. I prayed before writing all of them, and I was like, I don't even have any idea how best to start this. So how do you want me to start it? And the first thing that came to my mind was to point out, the discrepancies between what Jeremy was saying publicly and what he was saying on the ex-Mormon subreddit to his friends, because there were a lot of discrepancies. And I think, and that wasn't so much to attack Jeremy, but it was to point out that this thing that you are holding up as scripture and this guy you are holding up as your ex-Mormon prophet are not actually what you think they are. And if he's lying about that, or he's being dishonest, or he's shading the truth, or however you want to say it, he's making himself look better than he is, whatever. Everybody does that to some degree. So, whatever face he's putting on it, if that is not true, how can you trust the content of it? So that was my point, was to say, this isn't necessarily what it comes across as. And when I posted it, I did not advertise it. I just posted it in my subreddit. And I was not aware that one of my other moderator friends was passing it around to all of the different LDS related communities on Reddit and saying, hey, come read this, come comment. And I was like, oh, don't do that. That brought a ton of fire down on us. I was a little nervous about it, but I figured, 5 to 10 people would comment. It might bring out a couple of extra trolls just because of the topic, because, it's the C.E.S. letter. I was not expecting more than 100 trolls to come attack us. And it was bad. It was just a nightmare thing for a couple of weeks. And there was tons of brigading, where they would post it around to other subs and then encourage everybody to come flood our sub with trolling comments and stuff. And I got a couple of DMs and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, this is kind of what I was hoping to avoid, but okay. So for the first post or two, I kind of argued back, and then I was like, that's a bad idea. I need to stop doing that. And then
I only laugh because I've been there. I get it, right? That's a laugh of experience where you're like, these days I'm like post and ghost. That's my go-to, right? Because there's no change in anybody's mind. My hope is my stuff gets to somebody who's on the fence, right?
Yeah. I will respond to people who are neutral or positive. I will not respond to trolls anymore. I learned my lesson real fast. So that was kind of a bunch of trepidation on that one. I was hoping it would go mostly unnoticed, except for by the members of our subreddit. And it didn't. And there were just as many on the next one. And they all kept saying, well, why are you talking about Jeremy? Why aren't you talking about the content of the C.E.S. letter? Because you can't, right? And I was like, the very first thing I said was, this is going to be a series. This is the first post in the series that we're going to do. And that, we would talk about that in a week or two. And they just completely missed it. So we had to just keep pointing it out. This is the first one. Be patient. We will address the content in full as we go along. But yeah, mostly it was just a lot of nerves. That thankfully there was enough good commentary as well that I felt like it was beneficial to keep going. And pretty quick, the trolls did lose interest and drop off pretty fast.
There's only one time, I shouldn't say this. What I've noticed is that if you don't feed the trolls, they stop coming, right? Mm-hmm. If you feed them by engaging with them, they're just right there. But the second you just are like, shh, and you don't post back and you just post and ghost, they go away. They go away very frustrated, but they go away. Yeah.
So the Mormon subreddit, there are a bunch with very similar names, but the Mormon subreddit, for a while was posting weekly rebuttals to my rebuttals because they were people who had previously been banned on our sub for bad behavior. So they weren't allowed to post on our sub. And so that was really the only place that they could do it was on their sub. And I was like, that's fine, have fun, more power to you. If you want to talk about it, that's fine. I just didn't want to participate in their conversation. So they kept trying to drag me into it. And they did that for a while. It was like all through the couple of sections of it, they were posting those. And I still get they still do random posts against my stuff now. And that's fine. They can do what they want. But for the most part, the trolls died off very fast once we stopped engaging with them.
What did your family have to deal with any of that blowback from you posting on there at all?
No, they didn't really know about it for the first 6 months or so until it started. When they started posting them on Fair, they were under my real name and they had my picture on it. And so I had to tell them that was coming. And mostly they got good commentary. There were some threats made against me and against some members of my family, but my name is super generic. So unless you have more information, I'm very hard to Google. So that is good. But mostly, most of the attacks were over social media. They tried to dox me on the Mormon subreddit.
Jeez.
They failed miserably. That was before my name was on it, but they thought I was Michael Ash actually, and I got a good laugh out of that. He's a writer for Fair. He wrote the Bamboozled by the C.E.S. letter document.
Okay, that I gotcha.
So they thought I was him, which I thought was pretty funny. But yeah, they tried to dox me. John DeLynn on his Facebook, on his Mormon Stories Facebook, sent a thing telling everybody to flood my social media with Jeremy's first rebuttal to me. Jeremy was encouraging everybody to flood my social media. I had locked it all down when I started writing for Fair because I knew that it would be under my real name. So I just locked everything down as private so nobody was able to do that. But I still got well-meaning friends and family taking screenshots and sending them to me. So I saw it all. And I was like, I'm okay not knowing. It's all right, really. But they just wanted to make sure that I was okay and I wasn't getting really upset and everything. And so I appreciate the concern, but I didn't want to read it. So
right. I remember when I started this podcast, that was my main fear, was my family, right? You can take shots all day long at me. I'm fine. I got thick skin.
Yep.
None of that concerns me, right? It's my family I was most concerned about. Thankfully, most people have been pretty respectful, but I've gotten my share of hate from the same crowd that you got yours from, right? And they are vicious. And it caused me for a while to sit back and look. And here's what I've discovered through this, especially with folks on the anti-Mormon side, and especially those who have left Mormonism, is that they're still religious, Sarah. But they're, whether they want to admit it or not, they are still religious. They have their scripture, the C.E.S. letter. No man knows my history. Take your pick, right? An insider's view of Mormon origins. They still have scripture. They still have their prophets, right? Mm-hmm. Jeremy Runnells. John Dehlin, those sorts of people. So this idea that oh no, we're just no, we're done with that. No, you're not. You're really not, because you've just set up a different structure, right? Let's just call it what it is. And so and they will defend that
Yep.
just like any other religious person will defend their belief system. And in
And
some ways, it's even more vicious than anything I've ever seen come out of any Mormon's mouth. Um, certainly had my share of threats, right? Um, and that's okay. I'm good with that. But let's recognize for a second, you are approaching this with a certain amount of religiosity that may be of a more rabid brand than Mormonism or Catholicism or anything else.
no, I completely agree. And I've actually made that same comparison many times before about them having scriptures and prophets and things, because they proselytize, they pass them out like their scripture, they quote them, they spread them around just like we would conference talks or something.
Right.
And they are very vicious. Like I just a couple months ago, in fact, I cobbled together a list of about 70 direct insults made against me that were still active and visible on the Mormon subreddit. They had never taken any of them down, even though we all have a rule against insulting the moderators of other subreddits in the Mormon subreddit community. And they were vicious. They were calling me every single name you can think of was on there. They insulted every single thing about me. And I was like, that kind of sucks. Most of the time I just ignore it and it rolls right off me. But seeing it all cobbled together in this big, huge paragraph of one insult after another, I was like, that is horrendous. I can't even believe that kind of stuff comes out of somebody's mouth.
Yeah.
Like, I would never say that kind of stuff about anybody.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah. First off, let me say, I'm glad to see that somebody else recognized that as well. And two, I think you probably recognized it before I did. So we're going to call that your idea, but I don't want to take credit for that. But
I don't think that's fun to see it either.
So yeah, it's interesting to see how that side of the Mormon spectrum, so to speak, still organizes itself with those same ideas, scriptures, prophets, the whole ball of wax.
Absolutely do.
So you publish it, and did your stuff take off right away? Did you immediately see like, oh crap, this isn't just 5 to 10 people?
It was pretty quick. Yeah. The first couple of posts got a lot of comments, not just from trolls. I mean, they were really supportive comments too. And then I started seeing other people. So on Reddit, when somebody references you, they can ping you or tag you or something. And so it pops up in your mentions. And I started noticing that a lot of people were spreading them around and sharing them. And that caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that at all. And then I was, people started recommending them on other subs. Like I would go to comment and there would be like 5 to 10 comments saying, oh, go read these posts. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And then when they went up on Fair is when they really started getting traction. I started having people in my ward come up to me. And in my parents' ward, where I had grown up, my parents still live where I'd grown up. And so some of the old timers in the ward know me, and they would go up to my mom and be like, I read your daughter's stuff on Fair. That's so cool. And so that's when I started to really notice that it was people started recognizing me in, I wasn't just the quiet sister in the back row at church anymore, They started recognizing me and talking to me about it. And that was really a surprise. And then people started sharing them on Facebook, which was kind of weird. The only time I ever mentioned them on Facebook was just to say, hey, Fair's reposting this. If anybody's interested, I've been writing this for the past 6 months. And that's all that I said about it. But then people started sharing them every week. And I was like, that is so weird scrolling through Facebook and seeing my face there. Very weird. Just because I don't comment on social media very much. And then I started scrolling. I'd be scrolling on Reddit and they'd be reposted on the Fair subreddit. And so my face is sitting there, my name's on it. And I'm like, so bizarre. So that's when it really took off, was when they started getting posted on Fair.
Was there a moment, and I think I know the answer to this already, was there a moment at which you said, okay, I have some responsibility now. This is no longer just a hobby or anything else. I know I had my moment. What was yours? What was it that you were like, oh no, this is a responsibility now. People are kind of counting on this.
It was the first time I got a letter from a convert, a very young, very recent convert to the church, whose family was sending him all kinds of anti-Mormon material. And he wrote me this really beautiful letter. I still have a copy of it. He just said, I've been struggling so much. I didn't know how to respond to any of this. I'm brand new to the church. I don't know any of this stuff yet. I'm still learning it. I can feel when I read the Book of Mormon, I can feel that it's true. I can feel that, the Lord did restore the church, but I don't know how to respond to any of this. I don't know how to react to my family. But reading these helped me so much. And that just totally humbled me and blew me away. And I didn't even know how to respond to that. I was like, what do you say to something like that, But that's when I realized that people were reading them and they were using them and they were relying on them to help them learn this stuff.
I remember it was that couple I told you about that had sat down, watched Under the Banner of Heaven, when I got that email from that LDS couple. And he just kind of said, thank you, we can go back to church now. And that meant a ton. But it is humbling, right? Because look, I've said it before on the podcast, and I really mean it. I'm a clown with a microphone, right? This was born out of either a prompting from the Spirit or a bad slice of pizza the night before. And time will tell which is which, right? But I all of a sudden, when there's people that's counting on it, takes on a different feeling, right? Takes on a drastically different feeling, and you kind of feel like you're on the hook a little bit. And so but every once in a while you get one of those letters, right? Or one of those emails where you're like, well, we're going to keep going. Whatever this takes, we're just going to keep plugging away at it and see where it leads.
Yeah. It is very humbling because I know I would not have been able to do it without Heavenly Father's help. And I leaned on him a lot, and I leaned on the Spirit. I was praying all the time, like, help me find sources for this. How do I respond to this? And then light bulb moment, it would just come. And I know that wasn't from me, that was from him. So I know that was something that he was directing, and that helped a lot too, to know that, okay, I don't know why he wants to use me to do this, but if he does, I will let him. I'll go with it and I'll do what he wants me to do. And I hope I won't mess it up too badly, So it's very humbling but that's one of the things that I appreciate about, learning about the prophets and their flaws and things is, Heavenly Father found a way to use them. And that means that he can find a way to use me too, because I am way more flawed than they are. But if he was able to use them, then he can use me too.
Absolutely. I've had those same conversations with myself and with God. And I don't know about you, but when I first did my undertaking, I was coming up with every reason in the book I shouldn't, right? I'm like, I say things that piss people off all the time. You don't want me. You want somebody else, I mean, gosh, I wish I was more Joseph Smith, but I can identify more with Brigham because I'm more direct and more blunt. And so I'm like, you need somebody different. And he's like, nope, you do this. I'm giving this to you. So I can totally identify with those feelings of unworthiness and being unqualified and all those other things. I totally can dig on that and respect that totally. So when it gets to Fair, how does Fair reach out to you, and what was that like? Because I mean, within the LDS community, Fair's big, right? I mean, this is a collection of scholars and people who've put the work in, so to speak.
They are, yeah. I don't think they're as well known maybe as some of the other big sites, but yeah, they a lot of people are aware of them, and they do have a reputation for being more scholarly and academic, and that is not really me. Um, so they reached out through the guy on my mod team who is on the fair board. I'm not going to dox him in real life, but his handle is Atari Guy, and he is a longtime volunteer with Fair. He is pretty high up in the organization. I mean, they're all volunteers, so he doesn't get paid for it or anything, but he is pretty high up on the board, and he took them to Scott Gordon, who is the president. And I didn't know any of this was going on, but he went the post for a couple of weeks, and Scott really liked him. And like, I guess it was a few months, it was about 6 months into it when he approached me, but he just sent me a direct message on Reddit and was like, "Hey, so I've been doing, I've been sharing all your stuff with Scott, and he loves them, and he wants to post them on the fair board, on the fair blog. Is it okay? We'd have to put your real name on it. We'd put your picture on it, all this stuff." And I was like, "Oh, wow. Okay." So I thought about it for a little while, but I had promised Heavenly Father that if he helped me, I would say yes to whatever else he wanted me to do in
And
connection
that's
with
how
those
he
posts.
gets you. That's how he gets you every time.
So because I said that, I went, "Do you want me to do this?" And he said, "Yep." And I said, "Okay, all right, I will dox myself, and I will put my name and face on all of these, and I will let you post them." And so then they just started posting them. One, so half of my mod team is affiliated with Fair. It's pretty much is it, all of them but one now, on our little 6-person team. But one of the other volunteers with Fair was the guy who posted them on the site for me. So I wasn't even that affiliated with him at that point. And then I went to the conference, and they gave me a really pretty award that I wasn't expecting either. But Atari had reached out and was like, "We want to make sure that you're coming." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm coming. I already bought a ticket. I'll be there." And he goes, "Okay, good. We have some really cool things planned." And they asked me to do it like a little lunchtime panel for people who were there. So I thought that's what he meant. I didn't realize he had also put me up for that award. So that was a surprise. I had been intending to officially volunteer with Fair. I hadn't yet at that point. They were just reposting them. I wanted to get finished with it all first before I started doing other things for Fair, because it was such a lot of reading and writing, and it was just a big undertaking. So I hadn't joined, and so Atari signed me up as a volunteer anyway, which he knew I wanted to. He was just like, we've asked you 5 or 6 times and you haven't done it yet, so we'll just do it. And when you're ready, you can step into it, but you'll be signed up. So they got me a t-shirt, and they got me like an email address and everything, and added me to the email lists. And after I was done, they asked me to turn it into a book, which we started doing. And then they asked me to do the other series that I'm doing now. And so that kind of took the place of the book for a while, but it kind of snowballed from there.
Gotcha. So do you think the CES letter is still having the kind of impact it did back in 2013, 2015? Or do you think it's kind of fizzled out?
I don't think it's fizzled out. I don't know that it has the same dramatic level of impact that it did when it first came out, but it is still pretty influential. Like, we still get people all the time who are just stumbling across it, and who are just hearing about it for the first time and just spiraling. And it's still getting passed around like crazy by it's mostly the youth that I've noticed that are passing it around to their friends and family members who are older, and it's the first time that they're hearing about it. And I'm not sure how it's the first time they're hearing about it, but I guess everybody knows different things. So Um, I don't think it's quite as big as it was when it first came out, but it's still pretty big.
It still takes some defending to get through that.
Mhm.
Um, what kind of things are we seeing now within, because Mormonism as a whole, I really feel like is at this place of just kind of being used as a theological pinata, right? It feels like right now everyone's taking a swing, right? What other things are you guys seeing coming out now that's really damaging people in their testimonies from the anti-Mormon side of things?
The Daybell case, Lori Vallow, that one is getting a lot of traction right now. Under the Banner of Heaven did. Um, there are a couple of high-profile sexual abuse cases against the LDS Church right now that are doing a fair bit of damage. There are a gazillion copycat letters that are coming out. But interestingly, we are also seeing a lot of people who left because of that material who are now coming back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. I feel like sometimes, and at least my experience, um, I get a ton of email from this. And fortunately, I have a family who's gotten really good at answering a lot of those, because a lot of times it's just asking for resources. Where did you see this? Where did you find this? And so now we can almost, I literally have just kind of a small library on my laptop with different names where it's just, okay, here you go, click, click. But every once in a while, my family knows, okay, this dude's really struggling or this lady's really struggling, and you're going to need to talk to them. And panic is the exact word I would use, right? I mean, there are times that I will, if they leave me a phone number, I'll call them. I'll be like, okay, first, breathe. That's your first thing you need to do is just breathe. Just relax. You'll get through this. But I do think that because it is aimed at your core pillar, right? Your Mormonism's unique, and it's one of the things I love about it. The restored gospel is unique in the sense that it's not just a Sunday thing, right? This is something you build an entire identity around. It is very much a subculture or a counterculture within mainstream America. And so it's got its own language, its own customs, its own dialect in some ways. I mean, it's a different ball of wax, right? And so when someone takes aim at something like that and then starts eroding those foundations, there is a very large sense of panic that ensues. And so, yeah, just it doesn't surprise me that people are coming back, because I think once they are gone and then they're like, oh, look at, I'm really not happier here. And look, they found horses, or, they found iron, or whatever the case is. I think that knee-jerk reaction is where we have to catch people the most, right? Before they make a decision based off of fear and off of sadness and uncertainty and all those things, let's just bring this back, right? And one of the things that surprised me in being LDS and being a fundamentalist is we're all dealing with the same stuff, right? All of us are. I just talked to a young man who just got back serving a mission from our church, and we were just talking, and he talks about, at 15, he's not sure he wants to do this anymore. This is boring. I don't want to do this. I want to move with my friends. And so I'm like, yeah, we're just like everybody else, right? We really are. We all have to have that conversion moment. So and that's why I reach out to you, because there really is, we're not that different in a lot of ways. And sometimes the same attacks that are meant for the LDS Church are absolutely going to be attacks on our theology. Where do you see that Vallow case really doing the most damage? Because as I read Chad and Lori's theology, it's about as Mormon as, and I'm a fundamentalist. So if I have to look and be like, bro, like that is not Mormon at all, right? I have a hard time calling them Mormon, when some of their theology is so radically different, almost the exact opposite of what Joseph and Brigham and John Taylor taught. What kind of things are you dealing with off of that? I mean, how is this hurting people?
The big thing that we're seeing right now is the whole energy healing thing, that the Reiki stuff that they kind of got into as well. It's not just a Mormon problem. Like it is very popular. Like if you look on Etsy and you look up the Reiki term, I mean, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of websites, little shops selling crystals and oils and like all kinds of little things to help you channel your energy and do these healings. Like they have little wands and all kinds of stuff. Like it is a big business, and that is the kind of stuff that led to like the zombie thing. And they're all kind of connected through the energy healing, as opposed to some of the more fringe doctrines. And that is kind of taken over. A lot of people are doing that. They see them as being similar to priesthood blessings, and they're not. It works in a completely different way, and it is clearly it has some weird background attached to it and some weird fringe beliefs and stuff. But that is the thing that, like, a lot of people don't see that as being something that they shouldn't engage in, because they think, oh, well, it's just using the priesthood in a different way. And I'm not the one doing any of the healing. I'm letting God heal them through me and things like that. And you're like, no, that's not quite right.
Right. No, I get it. Yeah, it surprised me when you said that, because after reading some of the stuff that Chad and Lori had said, I mean, look, even the reincarnation thing, right? And in fundamentalism, it's called multiple mortal probations, and that's even somewhat fringe, even for fundamentalists, right? I mean, most of us are like, I don't think so, right? But so the fact that they're seeing that, and that's what's doing the damage, is somewhat surprising. Do you have any idea on why that is so appealing to some folks?
So something that I have come to learn over the years is that Satan often creates counterfeits to things of God.
Mm-hmm.
Hiram Page's Black Seer Stone, or I mean, there are all kinds of things. Like you could say people who are living together as opposed to getting married, things like that, where, I mean, you can find it in any area you can think of, just about. If Heavenly Father uses something for his purposes, Satan will find a way to use something similar for his purposes. And so I think that this is one of those cases where it kind of mimics priesthood blessings in a way, and it kind of mimics priesthood power in a way. And so Satan is using that. Like it could be perfectly benign. And, if somebody is not using it for religious purposes, I mean, I personally wouldn't. I would avoid that. But, if somebody who is not religious is doing it, they're probably going to be fine. But when Satan is actively trying to use that for his purposes, it will do a lot of damage. And I think that one of the things that he was doing here.
Perfect. Let me ask you this question. Someone you know and love, and this is for you answering any of my listeners. Someone they know and love comes to them. Let's say it's a father and his son approaches him, or a mother and her daughter approaches her and says, I found the C.E.S. letter and I'm shook. How should they respond? I mean, what's the appropriate response?
Empathy, for sure. Because for some reason in our church, even though both of our churches were founded on Joseph Smith asking questions, because he had, he was hearing things that were weird to him too. And so he had questions and he went to God and asked questions and the gospel was restored, but for some reason, questions are seen as something negative in our society today, and they shouldn't be. Everybody has questions. I have questions. You have questions. We all do. And that shouldn't be something to be looked down on or judged for. And I think that is probably one of the things that does damage is, first of all, the people who are reading it are scared that they're going to be judged for reading it and for believing it and for having those questions in the first place. And so it's really hard for them to ask those questions to begin with. And once they do ask them, the reaction is a big part of it too. If people aren't supportive and they aren't like, well, okay, I don't know how to answer that, but let me help you find it. If they're just like, oh, stop reading that. Why are you wasting your time with that? Don't do that, avoid it. Then they're like, well, I didn't give it any answers to my questions. Those questions are still there, even if I put it away. So I think empathy and understanding go a long way. And I think a willingness to look at the questions and to look at what it says and to start looking where you can find answers. Because, Jeremy does provide sources for a lot of the stuff that he talks about, but you have to learn how to weigh and evaluate sources. And you have to learn how to figure out where to go to find answers. And you have to be able to ask Heavenly Father and to lean on the Spirit while you're studying those things. And a lot of people don't really, for some reason, we don't really put a whole lot of emphasis on that when you grow up in the church. It tends to be more of, get your testimony and, listen to the Spirit and stuff. But it's not really, if you have questions, there are thousands of resources out there for you to use to find them. And here's how you can do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. The empathy thing is huge. Again, the same young man I talked to, he talks about going to his dad and his grandfather and telling them, hey, I think I'm Splitsville as soon as I'm 18. I'm out of here. And they both were just, I think his dad says, look, you got to make your own decision, but no, I'm always going to love you and I'm always going to be here. Right. His grandfather said something really profound. He said, don't throw something out that's totally untested. And I think that is a beautiful sentiment, because so often what I see is that these issues come up, right? Whether it's Jeremy's letter, whether it's from Fawn Brody, whether, whatever it is, it's going to come up. And there's going to be more. I can guarantee there will be more. Someone's going to get pissed and they're going to write more crap, and we'll be debunking this. And on the surface, it'll seem like a real slick argument. But that idea of just don't throw it out until you've tested it thoroughly, I think has a lot of merit. And be patient with it. Be willing to sit with that. And then I think as parents and as leaders, and maybe people who've had a little more time to digest this, just be patient with that too. And I think the other thing is don't make our answer their answer, right? Let's help them find it themselves. Because if we just try to spit something at them, it's not going to stick. If they find it, it's a different story. Or if they read it and they begin to digest it. So to me, that was huge. But Sarah, is there anything we didn't cover that you want to cover?
I would just say, going in line with what you were just saying, I think that is something that's another point that I have made before. And I think it's something that people need to recognize and understand is, you can, so in today's day and age, a lot of people don't read anymore. They just expect people to hand just everything. With the internet, it's so easy to just Google something and you have the answer in like 10 seconds. And so they expect that from the church, but that's not how Heavenly Father works. And he expects us to put in the effort. And he expects us to go through that refiner's fire and to go through those trials and those struggles and seek out the answers to the questions. Like, That scripture to Oliver Cowdery in the Doctrine and Covenants, study it out first before you come to me and ask. And that's what he expects us to do. And so many people don't expect that, but you have to find your own answers. You can't rely on anybody else to do it. And the whole point of those posts was to say, these are some places where you can go to find answers, but don't take my word for it. Don't take Jeremy's word for it. Listen to Heavenly Father and find your own. So I think that is something that's very important to remember and to focus on.
Awesome. All right. Well, Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, let's do this again, because there's plenty out there for us to discuss. So perfect. All right. Well, good enough. All right. Stick around for just a few minutes, Sarah. Everyone else, we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.